Today's gospel is from Luke, chapter 13. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at the wonderful things that he was doing. The Gospel of the Lord. Now it's time for Children's Chapel. Just let them roam out. You can walk in the center. Okay, go. Is your mic
on? God, take my lips and my words. Use them in the name of your one holy and undivided Trinity. That's a powerful mic. Okay. There we go. Amen. Well, good morning. It's so nice to be with you all here today. I'm Reverend Melanie Mullen from St. Paul's in Richmond, Virginia. And I went to seminary with Margaret, like she said, and I never thought I would leave the D.C. metro area. I was having so much fun here. But St. Paul's was on a different journey. They were going to do something really original and wanted to do a different kind of mission, something that has never been tried in the Episcopal Church before. So I have a very weird title that we totally made up. I'm called the Downtown Missioner, and it only means what we want it to mean. And what they want it to mean is something about who they are as a people. So they're the last church, the last historic church right there in the middle of downtown Richmond, beside the Capitol and all the historic places. It's the place where the Civil War ended and the generals were sitting there, and it's like a museum. It's like a place full of history from the early 1800s, and people come there 7 days a week. They're taking pictures of the stone in the windows, and they think that it's not a living congregation, but it is. It's a vital place. And way back in the 80s, the 1980s, these people who were this old Richmond elite group said, "You know what? There's something different God is calling us to do here and now, and we don't know what it is." So they started doing a lot of outreach. They put their whole hearts into it. They've got food pantries and hot food service, and they adopted a school, and they're all about the community, and we have civic forums. And then they started noticing that, well, there are all these young people moving into downtown Richmond, and they're not from Virginia, like the rest of us. We're Virginians. And they're like weird people, and they live in these old lofts and factories, and we don't know who they are, but we're the last church here, and there are no houses here. They're just like lots of interesting people living in these old factories. How do we get to know them? How do we become good neighbors with them? And what's that all about? And so they got to thinking, and they said, well, let's call a clergy person to help us go out into the city and get to know our neighbors in new ways. We're kind of afraid of them, kind of don't know what we're doing, and we just like to be about the city. Let's figure it out together. And that's how I wound up in Richmond with my made-up job and my made-up title, doing some kind of work that we're trying to figure out together. What is God doing in the world? And there's something about that hearing the call and being willing to go out and tell the story, the little echoes of that in the little gospel story that we heard today. It's the story from Luke of a woman who's so bent over, her back keeps her from looking people in the eye. Her back is totally bent over, and she's old, and she's frail, and no one notices her, and she's just invisible. But she's there in the midst of that community, sort of wandering around, and she shows up at the temple where all the big guys are and they're teaching and they've got their theology degrees and they're doing all their stuff. And Jesus sees her. She doesn't ask for help. He just sees her. And he yells at her and tells her she's free. She's healed. And she stands up. And what does she do in the story? She starts praising God because she's standing. But then there's a conflict. The teacher, the big leader of the synagogue, stands up and he's outraged. He starts yelling, hey, what are you doing? We have 6 days a week for healing. We've got a whole healing program package. Our outreach ministry of healing is very well organized. We've got some forms. You just bumped to the front of the line. Now, it's easy to say that this person, this Pharisee, is the bad guy in the story. I mean, how could you, harsh on this good vibe of Jesus healing this woman? But, I've got a little pity for him. He's a really well-trained person. He means well. He got, a minor in, healing arts at the temple, seminary. He was really trying. And I think we've all had that experience. You got the food pantry. You know how much peanut butter you've got. You lay out all the bags. You got your book bag ministry. You're really trying. And then you find out that someone's come with a request that you just can't fill. They elbow their way to the front of their line. You realize that maybe your good works are just never going to be good enough. I mean, you could try harder and harder and harder, but is that quite the point? That frustration that oh my gosh, I can't do this. We have this whole system. There's a failure here. Then maybe that's what that Pharisee is shouting about. The sense of shame and failure that, oh my gosh, all those good works, they're not going to get it. What's going to happen? But I think something in that story, something in Jesus' healing of this bent back woman and her standing up and telling a story of praise about God has more of the answer to us. It points to the fact that the failure is not in the hearts or in the efforts of the Pharisees so much as in the system and in the response. Maybe the response isn't, get back in the line and get the forms. Maybe the response is more of what that woman did. Immediately she stood up and she started praising God. She started giving accounts. She started telling a story, a really public story to anybody who would listen. God did great things for me. Can you believe what happened? I was bent over. My back hurt. I could barely move. It was so sad. And then it was all better. And I bet she had a little tear in her eye. I bet there was something about her sparkle that made people remember and wonder. It wasn't embarrassing. She didn't have a tract. She wasn't going, hey, come out and join my church. But she was saying, I was kind of sick and now I'm better. I was kind of sad and now I'm happier. There's something about telling a story that's really important to the concept of mission, to the concept of what healing really is for Jesus. Telling a story that over and over again helps us. I used to babysit kids when I was in grad school in Washington, D.C., way before seminary. And I had 3 little sisters, and the littlest one was fearless and unafraid of anything. And they used to play a game with each other and say, remember that time? Hey, remember that time we had sandwiches for lunch? Hey, remember that time? Over and over again. Remember that time we had breakfast this morning? Hey, remember that time? And they just laughed and laughed, and it was a little thing. Well, one day we were out walking, and we're up DuPont Circle, and little Kathleen, the fearless one, sees a stranger, but he's coming out of a house near hers, and she runs up. She says, hey, what's your name? He says, I'm Eric. Oh, Eric, is that your dog? Yeah, that's my dog. What's his name? Snickers. And she grabs Snickers. I'm in charge of this 3rd grader, and she grabs this little puppy, and the puppy bit her. She's crying, and I'm terrified I'm going to get fired. My child has been bitten by this dog. It's terrible. Oh, God, Eric's embarrassed. He walks off. And so we go back to the house, and I put the magic ointment on her finger because it wasn't bleeding, so olive oil. The magic healing ointment, and, she's all better. And Mom comes in for the evening, and they start playing their Remember That Time game again. Hey, remember that time? Remember that time we saw Snickers, and he bit me? And then she's laughing, and her sisters go, yeah, it was so funny. It was the best time. It was the best time. And I just thought, well, an hour ago you were crying, you were in pain, and now you're remembering the best time meeting your new neighbor, Eric. There's something I learned in that process of telling that story, their little game amongst sisters. Remember that time? Again and again. that's something about what the practice of mission is. It's telling that story of praise or of good news or of bad. It could be through a tear. You didn't know my grandma, but remember this time she was always cooking. You missed it, but it was wonderful. Those remembrances. There's a DC singer, songwriter, and activist named Bernice Reagan Johnson, who's the founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock. It's a historic group here, and she was a civil rights leader for many years. And when someone asked her, how did you go about doing your ministry, doing your civil rights work, and making this music through all those decades of hardship and oppression where you were just ignored? You lived in Southeast DC. How'd you do it? She goes, well, there are a lot of times where people ignore you. You're not real. You're not valid. You're a woman. You live in Southeast. You're not important. So you've got to just keep talking to yourself. You got to keep telling yourself your own story, the own story of the goodness, the joy that God brought to you. You just keep saying it so that the next time you have something important to say, it comes deep within. It comes from the source of truth in life. I think she was saying, you got to keep telling yourself, you remember that time? Remember that time? My back was bent over, and I could barely stand. And then something happened, and I stood right up. That's the praise of God. And that's all you need. You don't have to take a Bible and go out into the streets and say, hey, come on. And I never do that. I don't have to worry about Sunday services. I have rock concerts to throw and parties and picnics. But we tell all our people when you go out there, you meet their neighbor, you say, hey, what's your name? Are you Eric? It's great. I remember a time something good happened. Tell me about a time something happened to you. That's all it takes. Remember the time. And I think about that woman with the bent back. I thought about her all day. And I thought about that Pharisee. Because deep down, I think I have a little bit of both of them in me. You know, something, whether I'm bent physically or maybe like him, just bent inside my heart. Something's keeping me anchored down, and it could be anything. It could change from time to time, and I wonder if I'm aware of what that is. What has got the hold on me to keep me bent? And what's going to release me, to put me in the path of Jesus? To have him proclaim, you're already freed. Stand up and start telling that story. There was an old woman, and her back was bent. Do you remember that time? Amen.